Hello, my name is Paloma Bustos, and I'm a policy associate with the Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative, a program based out of Loyola Law School here in Los Angeles, focused on developing and advocating for policies that prevent human trafficking and support human trafficking survivors. In this presentation, I will be talking about how survivors of human trafficking can apply for income loss benefits through the California Victim Compensation Board under AB 629, a piece of legislation here in California that helps survivors get financial support as a result of lost wages due to trafficking. As we get started, I do want to provide a disclaimer that although our office has worked closely with CalVCB and the California Office of Emergency Services to increase outreach about AB 629 throughout the state, I'm not employed by either one of these agencies, and any information I share throughout this presentation is based on my own experience working directly with survivors of human trafficking in their attempt to access benefits through the CalVCB program. The Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative, which was launched at Loyola Law School back in 2021, is an evidence-based, community-informed think tank that intentionally fills the gaps in the prevention of human trafficking through an intersectional framework that fosters systemic change and progressive policy innovations. We also implement and support anti-trafficking strategies through an environmental, immigrant, economic, and racial justice lens. This means that our policies are not only based on research, but they're also directly informed by impacted communities. We prioritize the empowerment of historically marginalized and underserved communities who continue to face discrimination, oppression, and barriers to access resources and forms of justice. This includes people of color, immigrants, refugees, persons with disability, LGBTQ persons, and populations experiencing poverty or substance abuse. Our work includes connecting with service providers and the survivors themselves to understand the challenges experienced by human trafficking victims in order to find intervention points that improve access to benefits and resources available. Our program does not provide direct services and is strictly focused on developing and advocating for policies, and that is why it's important to hear from the voice of survivors and service providers to create change. Our team includes experienced practitioners who have worked directly with survivors of trafficking in different capacities, including direct legal services, to advocate for survivors during their interaction with the criminal justice system, help with the immigration process, such as applying for legal status to stay in the country and prevent deportation, as well as case management to address the trauma associated with their experience. For example, our director, Stephanie Richard, worked for over 15 years as a victim rights attorney, providing direct support to survivors to help protect and enforce their rights as victims. Because of her experience within the anti-trafficking field, she has also worked on advocating for policies that support survivors. In fact, she helped to draft AB 629 and invested many years of advocacy in helping with the passage of this bill during her role as a policy and legal services director with the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. She also oversaw their legal services program and provided technical assistance and training to provide service providers across the country. And in her role, she also worked on advocating to increase funding allocated by the California Office of Emergency Services for the Human Trafficking Victim Services Program, also known as the HB program, which currently funds 31 community service organizations across the state to provide support services specific to human trafficking victims. As I mentioned, I am a policy associate with the Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative, but before starting this project, or before working on this project, I also worked I also have over 10 years of experience working with victims of crime, including domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Prior to SJI, I also helped to co-launch the RISE Clinic with our director, Stephanie Richard. The RISE Clinic, which stands for Rights and System Enforcement, was a program that operated between 2021 to 2024, also here at Loyola Law School. Through this clinic, law students under the supervision of our director helped to represent victims of violent crime to seek enforcement of their legal rights during the criminal investigation and prosecution of their offenders. In other words, they ensure that the rights of that their rights as victims, what we know in California as Marsy's laws, were being enforced and protected. This included filing formal notices of appearances in criminal court to notify the court that the survivor had their own attorney and therefore should be notified of any court dates or court proceedings regarding the prosecution of the person who caused the harm. As part of my role in the clinic, I also taught the seminar class together with our director to help law students understand the impact of trauma and how this impacts the legal process. I also work directly with survivors being represented by the clinic and help to connect them with resources in the community, and applying for programs, such as helping them apply for CalVCB, as well as public benefits through the department. Before this, I also worked for CDLF Counseling and oversaw their domestic abuse response team, a program administered by the mayor's office here in Los Angeles that partners LAPD officers with community-based organizations to respond on scene and provide crisis intervention and provide support services to domestic violence survivors. As part of my role, I was assigned to oversee our partnership with 5 different divisions of the LAPD and the Central Family Justice Center here in Los Angeles. While there, I also provided crisis response, supervisor counselors responding on scene, and provided training to law enforcement on recognizing the signs of abuse and using a trauma-informed approach in connecting with survivors. So it's really through my work on the ground that I learned about CalVCB and other programs available for survivors, as well as the challenges that they can experience in accessing support, which ultimately has sparked my interest to work in policy and contribute to change that addresses systemic issues impacting survivors' access to justice and healing. By the end of this presentation, I hope that you as a service provider will understand AB 629 and how this law improves access to financial support for human trafficking survivors, and the important role that you play in supporting survivors to receive compensation and how to apply for income loss through CalVCB. Before we start, I also want to address the terminology that I'll be using throughout this presentation. You may hear me use both the terms victim and survivors when referring to individuals who have experienced human trafficking. We know that these terms are often used interchangeably, but they can carry different meaning depending on the context. The word victim is a legal term that refers to someone that has been harmed, injured, and wronged by a crime. It helps the criminal legal system to make sure that they are given certain rights or protections, like being able to receive restitution and compensation for what they went through. While victim is generally used within the legal context, survivor is used to honor the strength and resilience of a person. We know that both terms are important, and we respect the right of each individual to choose the term that best fits their journey. Now, before we talk about AB 629, I want to provide an overview of what the CalVCB program can do for victims of violent crime. However, I also want to encourage you to visit their website for more information about all the expenses that CalVCB can cover for crime victims. In their website, you can also find a link to sign up to participate in their monthly trainings, especially if you want to learn about how to navigate CalVCB process and to understand the crime-related expenses that they can assist to cover. At the end of the presentation, I will also provide an email that you as a service provider can use to contact if you want to receive more information about their webinars, which they provide each month to help service providers understand the different benefits that survivors can apply to through their program. So the California Victim Compensation Board is a state program that can help victims of violent crime who have suffered from injury or threats of physical injury to get reimbursement for expenses that resulted from the crime. The California Victim Compensation Board is a state program. However, it's not funded by taxpayer dollars. It's funded by people that have been convicted of state and federal crimes that have been ordered to pay fines and restitution. For instance, if a victim used financial assistance from CalVCB, the offender may be ordered to pay may be ordered to repay the program. There's also a percentage that comes from traffic tickets and funding from the Victim of Crimes Act, which we know as VOCA. Most survivors who apply to CalVCB are assisted by victim advocates from the prosecutor's office. These would be advocates working directly for the district attorney or city attorney's office here in California. However, victims can also apply on their own, or they can get assistance from an authorized representative. An authorized representative is any person that has written authorization by the person who is applying for the program to get help with the application. Representatives can include victim advocates from the DA's office, licensed attorneys, legal guardians, conservators, county social workers, and advocates from community-based organizations. The only individuals who may not be a representative are medical or mental health providers or agents who provide treatment to the crime victim. One of the goals we hope to accomplish with this video is to encourage community-based organizations, specifically those receiving funding from the California Office of Emergency Services, to help survivors of human trafficking apply for CalVCB. Not just provide a referral, but to actually help to file their application. We say this because what we notice is that CalVCB is a program that continues to be underutilized because many victims and service providers are either unaware that this program exists, or they don't know how to navigate the process or how to apply for the program. By understanding how CalVCB works, service providers, who are often the first point of contact for victims of crime, can help ensure that more victims access the support they're entitled to, making a big difference in the recovery process. As a representative, you can help survivors understand the application process by breaking down complicated forms and legal terms. Also, if language is a barrier, service providers can facilitate this process and connect survivors with translators or help with translating documents. Representatives can also help survivors gather necessary paperwork, such as statements from caseworkers, therapists, or healthcare professionals in order to apply and qualify for the program. Now, we also know that applying for compensation can be overwhelming for survivors when they're already dealing with trauma, physical injuries, or mental health challenges. However, we also know that community-based organizations are well-equipped to offer support in a way that is both culturally appropriate and trauma-informed. And this can ensure that survivors feel safe and supported throughout their application process. As a representative, you can also follow up regularly to check on the status of their application and encourage survivors to keep communication open with CalVCB for any additional information that they might be requesting in regards to their application. We have also seen that survivors who receive help from community-based organizations are also more likely to successfully complete and submit their application. This support can lead to better outcomes, such as receiving compensation for income loss, medical expenses, and mental health services, which can be crucial to a survivor's recovery. For instance, when I work with survivors in the Rice Clinic, I would avoid using legal jargons to help survivors understand what the program can do. I would also communicate with them every time I would receive a notification letter from CalVCB and would provide them with a copy to explain where their application was in the process every time I received a notification for the program. This was important because the progress or the process from when they file the application to when they receive the actual payment can be a process that can take many months. So we wanted to make sure that we did not lose contact, specifically or especially with those that did not have a stable housing. To be eligible for CalVCB, an individual must be a victim of a qualifying crime that involves physical or threats of physical injury or death. With this, survivors must provide evidence that they were victimized as a result of a crime. Examples of qualifying crimes include domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, and stalking. In general, victims of violent crime will submit police reports as evidence of their victimization. In cases of sexual assault or domestic violence survivors, they might use a police report, a permanent restraining order, or a letter from domestic violence or sexual assault counselors as evidence that they were victims of a crime. For certain crimes, emotional harm alone is enough to qualify. This may include a minor under the age of 18 who suffered emotional injury as a direct result of seeing or hearing a violent crime while in close physical proximity to the victim at the time of the crime. For our purposes, human trafficking is a qualifying crime, and by regulation, anyone who's a victim of human trafficking has suffered the injury needed to qualify for BCP. I will explain how this applies when talking about AB 629 as we go through the presentation. Applicants must also meet residency requirements. This means that either the crime occurred in California or the person was living in California at the time of the crime. For trafficking victims, it's not unusual for the crime to have occurred in multiple locations or across different states, but as long as part or some of the trafficking occurred in California, they can qualify for CalVCB. It is also important to note that California residents who become a victim of a crime in another US state must apply to that state compensation program as well. BCB will then verify that the victim filed a claim where the crime occurred, and if that state where the crime occurred is not able to cover the expenses that the victim is seeking to get covered, then CalVCB can help. A non-California resident, someone visiting the state, for example, who becomes a victim of a crime while visiting California, may also be eligible for benefits. However, they must also follow the same process and apply for their home state compensation program as well. There are also time limitations on when applications must be filed. Applications must be submitted within 7 years of the crime or 7 years from when the crime could have been discovered. So that means that, for instance, if the crime happened today, and then I, as a victim, would have 7 years to apply for the program. In the case of minors, victims under the age of 18 have 7 years after their 21st birthday to apply for the program. So whenever I was working with survivors during my time at the police stations, I would often encourage victims to apply for the program now and would connect them with the victim advocates with the DA's office or the city attorney's office. I would actually accompany them to their appointment, or I would be on the phone with them when they would speak to the advocates. One of the reasons I would strongly encourage them to apply and supported them through the process was because many times I had come across survivors who would later realize they would have wanted to apply for the program, but the time in which they could have done so had already passed. So I would tell them that they can apply for the program now. And if they see that maybe a couple of months from now, or even a year from now, they realize that they're still experiencing trauma symptoms as a result of what happened, and they want to do therapy, their application was already with CalVCB. So now they just needed to find a therapist who accepted CalVCB as a form of payment to get their sessions of therapy covered. CalVCB may consider applications filed outside of the 7 years. However, based on my own experience, not knowing about the program may not be sufficient for the program to make this determination. Some of the reasons that an extension may be granted can be complex, and in some cases, you may want to speak to an attorney before advising the client on how to apply. Some reasons that CalVCB may consider a late filing will be a recommendation from the prosecutor and attorney due to the victim's cooperation in the arrest and prosecution of the offender, emotional harm suffered during the prosecution, parole hearing, or release from incarceration, or events during the prosecution that led to more losses for the victim. Persons not eligible for CalVCB include persons who committed the crime or persons who were involved in the events leading up to the crime. However, CalVCB cannot deny an application solely on the basis of the applicant's immigration status. So a Social Security is not required to apply, nor is proof of legal residency or citizenship. CalVCB can also not deny an application based on the person's membership, association with, or affiliation with a gang. Now, when you look at CalVCB applications, you will notice that there are questions about whether the person applying for the program is on parole or probation for a felony and whether they are registered sex offenders. CalVCB can still accept their applications, but cannot begin to cover expenses for the crime while they are still on probation, paroled, incarcerated, or required to register as a sex offender. Once they are off from these, then the program can begin to cover expenses from the crime that they may have experienced. So once CalVCB has determined that an applicant was a victim of qualifying crime, they can cover a range of expenses related to the crime. These include medical and dental bills, mental health counseling for emotional trauma, and income loss if the victim is unable to work due to injuries of a crime, due to injuries or trauma, and relocation costs for victims needing to move to ensure their safety. Now, each claim must be supported with proper documentation, and there are limits on the amounts that can be reimbursed for each expense or limitation in the number of services that can be covered. That means that there are different forms that must be completed for each expense that a survivor is seeking to get covered. For example, if a survivor applies for relocation assistance to move somewhere else, they must have a form filled out by law enforcement, such as a detective working on their case, who can give their recommendation as to why relocation assistance should be granted for the safety of the survivor. The alternative would be a recommendation from a mental health therapist who believes the survivor should receive monetary assistance for relocation due to their emotional well-being. In this case, the maximum a survivor can receive in relocation is currently set at $3,400. Now, the maximum amount that CalVCB can reimburse in total per application to a victim for crime-related expenses is currently set at $70,000. Now, this does not mean that CalVCB will hand out a $70,000 check to the survivor. This means that each expense is subject to a monetary limit or services. For instance, as I mentioned, the maximum a survivor can receive in order to cover the cost of relocation as a result of the crime is $3,400. The maximum amount someone can get reimbursed for installing, let's say, a security system in the house is $1,700. And families of deceased crime victims can receive up to $12,000 to help with funeral expenses. In terms of mental health, the program can help to cover up to 40 sessions of therapy for direct victims. So the survivor can seek reimbursement for multiple expenses, but as the program is adding everything, they cannot provide more than $70,000 in reimbursement to a single applicant. This information is important to know because even when survivors are applying for CalVCB, they're not always aware of all the benefits that can be covered. When I worked out of the police stations, for instance, most people were only applying to get assistance with relocation and or mental health services. Another thing to keep in mind is that CalVCB is a payer of last resort, meaning that CalVCB only pays for expenses that are not covered by any other source. This means that the program will require the victim to show proof that the expense that they're seeking to be covered is not covered by other sources. For example, if they wanted assistance with covering medical bills, they have to show proof that their insurance, if they have one, cannot cover this bill. This would be the same if the victim had to miss this days of work as a result of the injury. They would have to show proof that they're unable to get unemployment insurance or workers' compensation. In cases where the victim applied to CalVCB and they were provided with compensation, but later end up filing and winning a civil lawsuit, they have to notify CalVCB and they most likely will need to pay back compensation that they may have received from the program. It's also not unusual for survivors to ask us for support with recovery for property damages. However, CalVCB does not cover these expenses. The survivor may have to seek other avenues for property damages, such as a civil lawsuit or a restitution order through criminal court. For a survivor to get restitution, there would have to be an active criminal case where the person who caused the harm is ordered to pay for the property damages through a restitution order. Other expenses not covered by CalVCB are court fees and legal fees. So one of the expenses that I mentioned that CalVCB can cover or can provide to a victim is compensation for lost income. This means that a crime victim can receive compensation as a result of missing days from work due to injuries or trauma. This generally requires providing documentation such as pay stubs or W-2s to help the program determine how much a person lost in income as a result of the crime and how much they can compensate. Victims of trafficking generally do not have access to the same type of documents used by victims of other crimes because traffickers do not generally provide a pay stub or W-2, and therefore survivors of trafficking do not have the same means to show proofs for lost income. So with AB 629, which went into effect on January 1st, 2020, this expanded the eligibility criteria for survivors of human trafficking to apply to CalVCB for compensation. More specifically, it authorized CalVCB to update its regulations and accept other sources or other types of evidence to determine eligibility for CalVCB and receive income loss. With this bill, it recognized that human trafficking victims are forced to work for little to no pay and deprived of their freedom to earn wages. This made human trafficking survivors eligible to receive up to $10,000 per year for a maximum of 2 years. So survivors cannot qualify for up to $20,000 in income loss paid through CalVCB. For example, if a survivor was trafficked for a year, the max they would receive in income loss is $10,000. If they were trafficked for 2 years or more, they would receive the full $20,000. Another major change made by this bill is that it allows survivors to apply for benefits without needing to report their trafficking experience to law enforcement. As we know, this is important because many survivors are hesitant or do not feel safe engaging with police due to fear of retaliation or simply mistrust of the criminal justice system. In the Rice Clinic, we actually worked in partnership with the Children's Law Center in Los Angeles to receive referrals for former foster youth who had experienced commercial sex. Each one of the law students who was part of our clinic assessed their eligibility and helped them to apply for income loss. We did this because we wanted law students to become familiar with the program because not many attorneys know about the program or they're just simply not filing applications to CalVCB. During the 3 years that the Rice Clinic was operating, our clinic was able to receive close to $700,000 in total income loss compensation for survivors served in our office. To qualify for income loss under AB 629, a survivor must show proof that they were a victim of human trafficking, whether it's labor and or commercial sex. And because we mentioned, or as I mentioned, when someone is applying to CalVCB, it has to be a qualifying crime and they have to show proof that they were a victim. For human trafficking, documentation for this can include a police report or a declaration from a human trafficking caseworker. Caseworkers are generally those case managers that work in organizations where they provide services to human trafficking survivors who can then certify that they are victims of human trafficking. That means that those of you who are working for organizations being funded by the California Office of Emergency Services under the HB program may be able to sign off on these letters. Another option to show proof would be a T-visa approval notice. This is an immigration status provided to victims of severe forms of trafficking. Survivors also have to show proof of income loss. This evidence can include, but not limited to, a statement under penalty of perjury from the survivor themselves, a human trafficking caseworker, a licensed attorney, or a witness to a crime. The statements must include the date of when the trafficking started and ended and the approximate hours worked per week. So many people asked us if both sex and labor trafficking victims can apply to the program. And the answer is yes, because they're not being compensated for their illegal work, but they're being compensated for the time and the wages that they could have earned if they had not been trafficked. This is true even for victims of forced criminality. For those of you who have not heard of this term, forced criminality is when the labor that a victim is forced to perform could be considered a crime. For example, this can be someone that was forced to cultivate and sell drugs as part of the labor they were forced to perform for the trafficker. So they too would be eligible to receive income loss. It is also important to know that this benefit is only available for new applications filed with CalVCB after January 1st, 2020. For example, if trafficking happened within the last 7 years, let's say in 2018, and they have not applied to the CalVCB program, they can apply now to the program and receive compensation for income loss. Another scenario would be that if a victim applied for CalVCB in the past, but perhaps the application they filed before was for DV or sexual assault, but later on they also became a victim of trafficking, then they can file a new application and request income loss for their experience with human trafficking. So that means that they will be treated as two separate applications. Again, this is as long as it was filed within 7 years of the crime. We actually had two situations at the Rice Clinic where we discovered that two of our clients had already filed applications with CalVCB before 2020. This happened in part because the survivor didn't recall applying for this program in the past when they were receiving help from an advocate. However, we discovered that their applications were filed as a sexual assault victims and not human trafficking, which was what they had actually experienced, but had been misidentified. So we filed a new application because we wanted the survivors to receive income loss due to their experience with human trafficking. In these cases, we actually received letters from CalVCB saying that their applications were denied because according to the program, there were previous applications that had been filed describing the same incidents that we were using to file their new application. However, we appealed the decisions so that they can be rightfully identified for human trafficking and therefore be provided for income loss. For this, we provided a copy of the TBSA approval as further proof that the crime that they had actually experienced was human trafficking. And the applications were actually eventually approved for human trafficking. As I mentioned earlier, the CalVCB process may be overwhelming for survivors, and they often face barriers when trying to access compensation that can discourage them from seeking support from the program, such as language difficulties, struggle with gathering documentation, lack of knowledge about their rights, or mistrust of the criminal justice system. However, another barrier we notice is that there's still a lack of awareness about applying for income loss. Based on our own inquiry into the number of survivors being served by community-based organizations within the HB program, we noticed that there are as many as 3,000 to 4,000 survivors that are being served annually by the 31 community-based organizations who are receiving funding from the California Office of Emergency Services. However, in 2023, we saw that only or less than 300 survivors had actually applied to receive income loss. So this suggests that there are many potential victims or applicants who remain unaware of the compensation from the program. As I also mentioned earlier, the length to process a claim for income loss can take many months, during which the survivor might still be faced with ongoing financial challenges or other issues that may impact whether they want to apply and continue with the process. That's why from the beginning in our clinic, we would set expectations with the clients that this process can take at minimum 6 months for it to be completed and for them to receive their check. For the cases where we actually filed an appeal, the program's decision to approve and finally approve their application actually took over a year. However, during this process, we were helping survivors to access other types of support and resources, such as helping them apply to benefits through the Department of Social Services to receive cash assistance. Survivors can apply for CalVCB online or they can apply through mail. Currently, only survivors and advocates from the prosecutor's office have access to the online application. However, as a service provider, you can sit with your client, create an account for them, and file the application online when you are with them. You can also help survivors to complete and submit the application by mail if that's easier for you and your client. In our experience with the clinic, all the applications that we filed through the clinic were done by mail. So when you're applying to the CalVCB program, these are the things that you want to include with your application. You want to include a cover letter. You want to include the application for the Crime Victim Compensation Program, a human trafficking caseworker declaration, a declaration from the applicant, and a human trafficking wage verification form. So this is what the application for the Crime Victim Compensation Board looks like. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to show you what this application looks like as we get onto this presentation, or what information you can enter as you're filling out the application. In terms of the human trafficking caseworker declaration, a caseworker, like I mentioned, is someone that works for an organization that provides direct services to human trafficking survivors. A human trafficking caseworker would be someone that falls in line within the California Evidence Code 1038.2, which describes that a human trafficking caseworker is a person working for a human trafficking victim service organization, whether financially compensated or not, for the purposes of rendering advice or assistance to victims of human trafficking who meet the following requirements. They have an advanced degree or a license, such as a master's degree in counseling, social work, or a related field, and at least 1 year of experience in caseworker, at least 1 year of experience as a caseworker working directly with victims of human trafficking. They also have 40 hours of training in areas related to human trafficking, confidentiality, and victim support. And when we're talking about a human victim service a human trafficking victims organization, that is a non-governmental organization or entity that provides shelter programs or other support services to victims of human trafficking. I will also be showing you a sample of the caseworker declaration that we would use through the RISE Clinic. Now, this is what a declaration from an applicant will look like. As you can see, it's under penalty of perjury, and they will basically have to describe that they were a victim of human trafficking, when the human trafficking started and when it ended, and how much, if anything, they were paid from the trafficker a week. And so I will also be showing you how this declaration looks like when we're applying for income loss. Finally, the other form that you must include is what CalVCB calls the human trafficking wage compensation verification form, which also asks you to describe the number of hours worked per week, the type of trafficking they experience, and obviously their information, and then a signature from the victim. So I will now show you how these forms can be filled out. So what you see here on the screen is the application for crime victim compensation. This is the form that you will use in order to help them apply for the program. Again, this application is available online, or it can be filed electronically through their online portal. So when you're entering the application, you'll notice that the first section is asking for information about the applicant. You're entering their basic information, their name, their social security number, if they have one. If they don't have one, you can see here that they don't have to enter it, or they can say no. Their date of birth. Now for the clinic, we actually would use our mailing address. And the reason we did that is because we had survivors in the clinic who either did not have a stable address, or they did not feel comfortable providing their address, and they wanted to keep their information confidential, or they were staying in a shelter. And again, perhaps they didn't have a stable address where they could receive mail. We will also use our own phone number and the email address for the clinic. The second part of the section, again, if the crime victim is the same person as the applicant, you will simply then re-enter the information of the victim into the section. In the next section, this would be if the applicant is a minor, and therefore the person applying for the program is a parent or guardian. We are leaving this blank because we're using an example of a survivor who is an adult, who is a survivor of human trafficking, to show you how you can apply for the program. In the next section, you will mark off what they're seeking in compensation or related expenses. In this case, we're marking off that they want to receive income loss. Now, if there's other services that the survivor wants to receive compensation for, you can mark this here. So for instance, if they wanted to receive mental health services, you can check the box that's on here in order for them to also receive compensation for mental health treatment. In the next section, section 5, this is where it's asking for information about the crime. Here, I mean, you just simply put see caseworker declaration, where it will have information, more information about why this person is applying for income loss as a human trafficking survivor. As you will see that if they don't know the name of the suspect or the name of the person who caused the harm, you can check the box here. Now you may wonder, like, how can they not know their name, right? I mean, if you've been working with survivors of human trafficking, you will notice that there are many who either do not know their name of their trafficker because they might only know their nickname, or they might only know their first name. Here, you will also enter the type of crime. You will notice that when you're looking at the drop-down menu, that human trafficking is not listed, so you will put other as a selection. And again, they will notice that they are a victim of human trafficking based on the rest of the evidence that you're providing. In section 6, this is important because this is where you as a community-based advocate will need to enter your information, your name, the organization's name, the address, and over here, the signature, your signature, and the date of when you're filing this application. Now, it's really important that you don't forget the signature, because if you're calling for CalVCB, if you're calling CalVCB to ask information about where this application is in the process, CalVCB may not release this information to you if this signature is missing from the representative information. Section 7 is about how the survivor found out about the program. So here, for instance, you can see that I put the case manager, Rice Clinic. The rest is, this part is information about their ethnicity, their race. Here you will see that I marked that this survivor, who I've used here in this form, is a fictitious client, and I have marked that they are Black or African American descent. The next part of the application is asking for information about their medical insurance. Again, if they don't have any insurance, they can put that they don't have any insurance of any kind. Now, if they did have their insurance, you will see at the bottom, they have the option to enter this information. Again, this is used because, as I mentioned, CalVCB is a payer of last resort, and so they can use this information for you to show proof, or for the victim to show proof that there's other sources that might be able to cover this expense. In section 4, for human trafficking survivors, the only thing you have to enter is what you see here that says employer was a trafficker. Next, you will see the caseworker declaration. As you can see from the caseworker declaration, you will notice that I did not include any specific information about the survivor's experience, because that's something that you're not required to do. You're simply certifying that the survivor was a victim of human trafficking based on your own expertise, based on your own knowledge. So as you can see from my declaration, I put here that I am a caseworker working with survivors of human trafficking, and have done so for over 5 years, and that I hold a master's degree in social work, and that I work for an organization that provides services to human trafficking survivors. And down here, this area you can leave as is, that the person that the US says is a victim of either sex trafficking or labor trafficking, and you're just simply signing and dating your caseworker declaration. The applicant declaration, this is what it looks like. Again, I've highlighted here the information that you can use to fill out. You can actually use this as a template, and all you would need to fill out is the information for their name, the period on which they were being trafficked. And here you can put on how many hours they worked and whether or not they were paid for the work that they were doing. As you can see here, as an example, I put that they did not receive any form of payment, and that all of the money that they were receiving was provided to the trafficker. Now, if the survivors, because this does happen, survivors will tell us they have received tips, or that they would keep the tips, right? That they would receive, for instance, when they were subjected to commercial sex. Tips are not discounted or taken, because what happens is, like, when you're in here, right, if you were to put that the amount the trafficker may have been paying the survivor, that amount may actually be discounted from the final compensation that the program will be providing. However, if they put that they only receive tips, this will not be used as a way of showing that they were receiving some form of payment from the trafficker. So that wouldn't be discounted from the final amount of their compensation. Now, if they say that they were receiving money, but that money was being used to pay for hotels or for food or for clothes, for their trafficking, then that would also not be considered as a form of payment or wage. So you would also not put anything. Now, this part right here is a part that if it applies to them, then you would keep this part, which I'm showing you on number 4. However, if this information does not apply to them, then you can delete number 4 and just leave the rest of the information. And on number 5, it says here, I have not received compensation for lost income or services from any other source. And then you would and that means, like, they're not receiving compensation, let's say, from a civil lawsuit, or something, or another suit where they're expecting to receive compensation. If that's not the case for them, then you just leave number 5 as is. And then again, the survivor will then date and sign their application. The other form that must be included with their application, as I showed you, is the human trafficking wage compensation verification form, which again asks for their basic information, their name, their date of birth, that they are the ones that are applying for the program and they are the victim of this crime. Again, I used our email address, our phone number, and here I'm marking off whether they experience sex trafficking or labor trafficking. If they experience both, and you would obviously mark off both. Again, you're including here the date of the crimes, and they are confirming whether or not they were working 40 hours or more per week. And if they didn't, and if, again, it's asking the same thing, if they're expecting to receive compensation from other types of sources. If they're not expecting to receive any compensation from other sources, then again, you can mark no on this application. One of the things that I actually forgot to mention, since I'm thinking about compensation that they can receive through other sources, on section 11, you will notice that it's asking if the survivor has filed a civil lawsuit related to the crime that they experienced. And if they haven't applied for one, you would just simply put no. If perhaps they're thinking about it, but they haven't applied for it, again, you can still state that no, they have not applied for the civil lawsuit. And the event that they do end up applying for one, then they would have to again notify the California Victim Compensation Program that they have done so. The rest of the information is just making sure that the survivor signs the application. As you can notice, as you will see, they have to sign on section 12 and section 13 in order to have a fully completed application. And again, the whole process itself, once you get used to filling out the forms, can take you less than an hour to complete. And so now we're going to go back to my presentation so we can continue with the rest. Right, and on the slides, you will see, which I will provide to CalOES and CalVCB in order for you to have a copy of this presentation. You will see the information that I shared about the human trafficking wage compensation form, the application itself, and the human trafficking caseworker declaration and the applicant declaration. So what does the process look like? So once the application has been submitted, the program will then send a confirmation notice that the application was received. Based on our experience, this can take anywhere between 30 to 60 days after the application was filed. The next thing is for the program to determine whether or not the survivor was a victim of crime. And so the next thing that the CalVCB program will provide is generally an approval or denial notice. In our experience, this can take anywhere between 60 to 90 days. Now, when they receive the approval, it is just an indication that CalVCB determined that the applicant is a victim of a qualifying crime. And the approval does not mean that they were approved for income loss. In other words, it means that CalVCB made the determination that the applicant was a victim of human trafficking, and now they will look at whether the victim will receive compensation for income loss. So for this part of the process, what they do is they assign it to an analyst who will review the applicant's declaration, the wage verification form, and determine whether the victim will receive income loss and how much it will be compensated. So from what I've been told by representatives by CalVCB, CalVCB can take up to 150 days for them to assign it to an analyst to review the application for income loss. It does not mean that they will necessarily take that long to assign it to a worker, but that's how long the program has to do so. When I have called a program because, let's say, I'm concerned about how long they're taking with the application, they will tell me whether it's still within their processing time. If they feel that if it's outside their processing time, then they will send a message to a supervisor to assign it to an analyst. Otherwise, there's not much they can do before that time. Once it has been assigned to the analyst then has up to 120 days to approve and issue the income loss. So again, the first part of the process is to determine eligibility, meaning that the program has to determine whether the survivor is a victim of a crime. Then they assign it to an analyst who will review the income loss benefits that the survivor wants to receive. Then they will determine the compensation amount that the survivor will be receiving. And the final part of the process, and that will be the general process for when a survivor is receiving income loss through the California Victim Compensation Board. Now, finally, while the survivor waits for their payments, there are a couple of things that you as a service provider can do to help them prepare. This is important because many survivors have never received lump sums of money. So there's a couple of things that you can do to help them keep their money safe. For instance, you can encourage them to go to a financial literacy program to learn about the basics of budgeting, saving, banking, and managing their debt. You can connect them with the local organization that provides this type of assistance. Now, one of the things that I experienced was when I was helping survivors apply for lost income, I recall receiving an email about financial literacy classes being offered by a bank. So this can be another option, checking with local banks to see if these classes are being offered if you're not familiar with any financial literacy programs offered by a community-based organization. Another example is that I used to facilitate support groups with victims, and the survivors participating in the class would often mention to me that they wanted to learn more about understanding credit and budgeting and really how to manage their finances. So one of the things that I did at that time is I arranged a visit from a representative from Wells Fargo to give some classes about ways that they can do this. Again, they were not there to get the clients to enroll in their banks, but they were there to provide some financial literacy information to the survivors. So this is another idea of what you can do to support survivors you are helping while they're waiting to get their compensation. You can also help survivors apply for bank accounts if they already don't have one. You can help them understand how to use banking services like checking accounts and online banking tools. For the survivors I work with, I actually created a PDF document describing some of these basics. It included information about the differences between credit unions versus large financial institutions like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and Chase. I also included information about the differences between using banks and cash checking places to cash their checks. And the reason I mentioned this, and I will talk to them about this, is because there were survivors who did not have bank accounts and would ask me about going to a cash checking place to cash their checks. So one of the things that I would inform them about was that these cash checking places often have fees, or they have fees in order for them to be able to cash their checks. So for instance, one of the locations near our office, I recall charged one of the victims $500 in order to cash their $10,000 check. So for this case, I mean, I did advise the client or against using the cash check in place, but ultimately, I mean, it's their decision. And she did decide to go through cashing the check because she needed the money right away. And when you're depositing a check like with that large amount into a bank, it does take a couple of days for them to verify it. And in this case, unfortunately, the survivor uh, wanted to use the money right away, and so they didn't want to wait for the bank to verify that the check was actually a real check. So you can also help them to manage these funds responsibly. This can include setting aside money for rent, covering immediate needs, or putting them into a saving accounts. In our cases, survivors use them to put down the deposit for their own apartment, buying a car, or putting their money into savings. So the ultimate goal is to obviously empower the survivor to take control of their financial lives independently. So at the end of the day, they get to decide what to do with their money. I remember I had a situation where the client did not want to open a bank account. And so when we were in a meeting together with their social worker, the social worker told the client that they would hold on to the check until the client opened a bank account so they could deposit the money. I noticed at that time that the survivor stayed silent and stopped responding to the worker. So these are the type of things you want to avoid doing or saying, because it only replicates the experience that they may have had with their trafficker. Ultimately, it is their choice about what they want to do with their money. In that case, I mean, the survivor did keep their check. The social worker only made that statement, but didn't actually do it. But even then, I mean, it already like impacted the relationship it had with the survivor. So again, these are things that you want to avoid saying, and just empower the survivor to make choices about their own money. In the screen, I promise you, I will show you information about the email or the contact information that you can use if you wanted to receive more information about webinars offered by CalVCB. For this, you can contact infoadvocate@victims.ca.gov, where you can contact them if you wanted to find out more information about the webinars. Otherwise, that information is posted on their website, and you can see the dates of when the training is being offered and the topic that they will cover during that presentation. You can also contact for outreach or publications. For this, if you wanted to contact public affairs at victims.ca.gov, this would be if you wanted to arrange a presentation for your organization about CalVCB. Again, these are great resources. And I forgot to mention, I mean, this is the number that you as a service provider or even the survivor themselves can contact if they wanted more information about their application. That number is 800-777-9229. Okay, so I hope this information was helpful, and I do thank you for watching the recording. Again, I hope it was helpful and that it encourages you to assist survivors in applying for the California Victim Compensation Board. And your support really makes a significance in the recovery and their journey. Thank you so much.